All right, so we've been talking about this ongoing battle over the COVID-19 vaccine patents. Obviously, the United States has been on the wrong side of this battle up until this point, and I do have some good news for you guys because it seems like, at least, and I'm going to, be cautious in my approach to this, and I'm going to point out some of the language that they use in this press release because it makes me a little bit kind of hesitant, but it seems at least that we have some good news on this TRIPS waiver that was put forward by India and South Africa at the World Trade Organization, and basically what this does is it relinquishes temporarily the vaccine patents for COVID so that a bunch of other developing and poor countries are able to start the process of ramping up production and distribution of generic versions of these COVID vaccines so that we can get as many people vaccinated as quickly and efficiently as possible and minimize the risk of having different variants that pop up that eventually negate some of the success that we've had with these current COVID vaccines. So here's the press release that Joe Biden's representative at the World Trade Organization put out, Ambassador Catherine Tai. So she's a U.S. trade representative. Here's what she had to say. United States Trade Representative Catherine Tai today released a statement announcing the Biden-Harris administration's support for waiving intellectual property protections for COVID-19 vaccines. Quote, "This is a global health crisis, and the extraordinary circumstances of the COVID-19 pandemic call for extraordinary measures." Good enough. The administration believes strongly in intellectual property protections. Don't really know what the fuck that means, but okay, you believe strongly in intellectual property protections, good for you, but in service of ending this pandemic, supports the waiver of those protections for COVID-19 vaccines. We will actively participate in text-based negotiations at the World Trade Organization needed to make that happen. Those negotiations will take time given the consensus-based nature of the institution and the complexity of the issues involved. The administration's aim is to get as many safe and effective vaccines to as many people as possible as fast as possible. As our vaccine supply for the American people is secured, the administration will continue to ramp up its efforts, working with the private sector and all possible partners to expand vaccine manufacturing and distribution. It will also work to increase the raw materials needed to produce those vaccines. So, all of that at the end sounds good, but the thing that kind of has me a little bit hesitant and wondering what exactly they mean by this is the negotiations part of it. Because, as I said, there's already this thing called the TRIPS waiver that was put forward where a lot of other countries have already signed on to this. I think it was more than 60 other countries signed on to this waiver, and hundreds of experts and scientists from around the world have signed on in support of this proposal that's already in there. So it's weird to me that they wouldn't bring up the TRIPS waiver specifically in this press release, because if you wanted to just support the TRIPS waiver, you could have just said that. But instead they're saying, well, we support negotiations and that those negotiations will then take a lot of time. So I don't really know what that means, and it kind of worries me that knowing who Joe Biden is, knowing the influence that the pharmaceutical industry has over somebody like Joe Biden and the people around him, it makes me kind of nervous because the longer negotiations go on with something like this, the more likely it is that they'll try to use this moment for leverage to try to secure some sort of other things that the United States wants, and use this as a moment in order to water down the TRIPS waiver, the TRIPS proposal. Maybe they'll make it so that, only certain parts of the intellectual property is shared. I don't really know, but that's what's worrying me, is that they weren't specific about saying that they support the TRIPS waiver, and they're instead just sort of generically saying that they support the idea of it, and I don't really know what that means. So I don't know what these negotiations will pan out. And by the way, it could just be the other case that I'm reading too much into this, and maybe they just, are talking about the logistical side of this and just saying, well, we basically support the TRIPS waiver and we just need to go in and sign the paperwork, and that's what they mean by negotiations. But I don't really know. They don't really give much more indication as to specifically what they mean. But that's where I'm at as of right now. I give Biden massive credit if he actually follows through on this in the way that it's portrayed here, right? And so he actually follows through. They completely relinquish the patents, and honestly, beyond that, I mean, so I honestly give him credit for that. But beyond that, this is just another lesson in why we should nationalize big pharma. Okay, there's no reason why the profit motive should be anywhere near our pharmaceutical industry, period, at all whatsoever. And that's clear because of things like this. As pointed out by our friend Rob here, the possibility of mass human misery and death being alleviated ever so slightly has displeased the line. And of course, by the line, he means the shares, the stock prices of Pfizer, BioNTech, Novavax, and Moderna, whose apparently their stocks plummeted a little bit. It's not that much of a huge gap, and I'm sure that they'll just rebound immediately. But, they take a hit. And this just shows you when good news comes out about public health, right? This is bad news for the finances of these big pharmaceutical companies. So, in other words, the interests of these big pharmaceutical companies is diametrically opposed to the interests of public health, to the interests of global public health. So, I mean, this is perfect evidence as to why we need to nationalize big pharma. Again, no reason why the profit motive should be anywhere near pharmaceutical industry or the healthcare industry. These are things that we can do completely without being price gouged and ripped off by these private pharmaceutical companies. And this is just evidence for that. In addition to that, this is what the big pharma industry had to say about all of this. So, in response to the administration's support, the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America, a drug industry trade group, expressed strong opposition and argued that the move represents a break in long-standing U.S. policy over medical patents amid global inequities. Quote, in the midst of a deadly pandemic, the Biden administration has taken an unprecedented step that will undermine our global response to the pandemic and compromise safety. Go cry about it. A statement from Pharma reads, this decision will sow confusion between public and private partners, further weaken an already strained supply chains, and foster the proliferation of counterfeit vaccines. I mean, listen, by counterfeit vaccines in this context, you know what they're talking about? They're talking about the generic versions that will then be produced by all these other developing countries and go into the arms of people in poorer countries who currently can't get access to it. So, listen, all in all, fuck Big Pharma, fuck them for having this sort of attitude surrounding the vaccine patents. They were perfectly willing to let mass death occur, mass preventable death occur, just to protect their bottom line, just to protect their profits. So again, this is all just evidence that we need to completely nationalize Big Pharma. I do give Biden heaps of credit if he actually does follow through on this in the way that it's portrayed. But again, we're going to have to wait and see how this all plays out. And this is genuinely just really good news. I mean, if it is how they portray it in that statement, then this is just straight up good news.